Okay. So there's a lot of discussion in economics about effects of shocks during early childhood. And some of the discussion that which is very interesting is that people have started talking about when those shocks occur in childhood. Shocks could be coming from poverty, shocks could be coming from healthcare, from education, whatever, trauma, violence, however you want to think about it. But now there is a very interesting discussion as to when these shocks happen. It matters. And I think that extreme events, when the shocks are very severe in magnitude, can tell us a lot about how to think about that issue. The second question, which is very important, is when these shocks happen, how much can parental socioeconomic status, SES, can compensate for these shocks. So these are the two big issues that I want to think about today. And they have serious implications for intergenerational transmission of inequality, and I think also thinking about how to really think about compensation and help for particularly for children. Oh, sorry. Just 1 second. How do I know? Okay. How does it work? Okay. So what do? So we look at this effect of the large earthquake in Pakistan 4 years after the fact. So the earthquake happened in 2005. So we are looking at the effect on these people in 2009. And this is using a cross-section. We don't have, it didn't exist kind of before and after data. So I want to really think about how can we make causal claims using just a cross-section. So I want to talk about that. So we look at comparison across villages far from and close to the activated fault line. And we are arguing that that provides a measure of the 4-year impacts of the shock. And the reason we make this claim that it can help us think about it in a causal way, for the shock is completely unexpected. It's unexpected in the sense of kind of economic horizons. I was talking to some geologists, and I said, listen, this was an unexpected earthquake. And they says, no, of course not. And I said, what do you mean? He says, no, this is a very active fault line. I'll talk about that. And they said, this has been a very active. I said, listen, I looked at the data all the way going back to the 19th century. In this particular area, there hasn't been an earthquake. He says, no, you have to go back to about like 2 or 3 million years. And over that time period, it's a very active area, but in a geological sense, not in the sense of like economic time horizons and so on. So it was unexpected that way. What we also show is we have a digital mapping of the fault line, and we have a random household survey, and we have distance from the fault line, and we have elevation, slope, and all that. And we argue that people were randomly distributed across the fault line. So the distance to the fault line really is causally will show what happens. And we show that, we try to show it in a number of ways. The other thing that people can think about when you do kind of cross-section work later on is migration. People move out of the affected area. So when you're comparing, right, and people will move out of the area selectively based on some observed or unobserved. And I think in this area, I'll talk a little bit about it, there's no attrition due to either mortality selection, that weaker people died, or some people died, or young or old, and migration. And then finally, the other big issue is age spillovers, right? I mean, I don't have a slide on this, but this earthquake resulted in a huge amount of aid coming in. So whatever we say is really the overall effect of the earthquake, not just the shock, but everything else that resulted due to the shock, including aid coming in. But the issue is that if there are big aid spillovers, right, so that people away from the fault line also got aid, and people closer to the fault line got aid, and then that might have been that will confound things, but I'll show you that's not the case. Okay, what do? Just in case I run out of time. So we look at 4-year impacts of shock on consumption, assets, children's schooling outcomes, enrollment and test scores, and child height and weight. This is a huge earthquake in Pakistan. Thousands of people died, a lot of aid effort. There hasn't been a study evaluating what happened after that. So this is the first one. So this is surprising, right? When we did it, we thought at least there'd be a lot of people who have done this kind of stuff because it was such a major event, but there isn't. Okay. And a lot of aid came in, a lot of effort went into rebuilding this area. And so our first big result is that what we're calling recovery to parity. consumption, assets, access to infrastructure have recovered. So people who are living farther away and people who are living closer to the fault line are no different on these dimensions. When we look at schooling, there are no differences in child enrollment too. This kind of results have been shown in other places too, right? So the classic is these papers after the Kobe earthquake, where all of this stuff, right? Recovery happens very quickly. If you look at the STAR study in Aceh after the tsunami, they clearly have these two effects. So most people have said that their recovery does happen. And if you look at our data, it looks like that. But we go one step further, right? So what we start doing is looking at child development measures, including physical development, and then test scores. So we tested a lot of kids in this. And there you see a very different result, right? I mean, if you just went into this area, and you go to Muzaffarabad now, right? I mean, it looks like a beautiful city, actually, much better than what it was before. I mean, with its Turkish architecture and all that stuff with rebuilding. But then, and you go to schools, all the kids are back in school. There's no difference if you go like 50 miles away from Muzaffarabad or 50 miles here. Everything looks fine. The area doesn't look like it was hit by an earthquake. But then, when you do height stuff, and I'll talk about it, and test scores, you see very big effects. I mean, these are pretty large effects, I'll show you that. Okay, and we're making a causal claim, right? And what is very interesting is, we also see this, right, which is very typical in kind of this shock literature, which is that the earlier you get the shock, the harder you're hit. Okay, so large differences in child death earlier on, after age 4. So if you were one more. Oh, I'm going the other way, sorry. I don't know. Okay, let me just go. I know the slide. If you were greater than age 4, the height effects are not there. So if you were like 5 or 6 by the time the earthquake hit, there's no difference between kids who are closer to the fault line and those who are away. But if you are in utero or ages 1 to 3, and the effect is kind of declining with age, very clearly, right? And the test scores, it's very interesting, right? So when we tested kids, we went 4 years after the fact. Because of our own limitations, we could not test very young kids. So we tested kids who were 7 years and older in 2009, which basically meant they were all greater than equal to 4 years at the time of the earthquake. So the kids we were tested are the ones who really did not have the height shock. And what we find is very strong test score differences. So the cognitive deficit is very high, even if you don't get the height shock. Okay, so it's not just that the biological shock and the height shock are kind of correlated. Even with kids who don't have the biological shock, you still get that height shock. The final thing that I wanted to put in was in our results, and rather than kind of go through it, the big question is, can these shocks be mitigated by household socioeconomic status? And there we have a result, which is, I think you can see it in some work done in the United States at different shocks also. So there is a pattern that clearly comes out of this. So which is that, so we looked at both maternal education and household consumption. Consumption you really see don't very many effects. So I'll just talk about maternal education. So what you see is for the height shocks, okay, parental SES does not compensate at all. So these biological kind of in utero shocks that the mom gets before the kid is born or when the kid is very little at the time of the earthquake, it doesn't matter whether you were coming from a rich family or a poor family, whether your parents were educated or not. So those shocks persist. However, when you look at cognitive shocks, right, so which is measured by test score differences, there what you find is that parental SES really, really matters. So kids whose moms were educated, and our sample is a rural random sample from 4 districts in the earthquake area. So when I say moms are educated, right, it's basically primary education, right? So it's not, I'm not talking about college education or anything like that. So moms with even that kind of an education, what we find is almost completely protect their kids from the shock. But moms who are not educated, right, they are the ones whose kids bear the brunt of the cognitive shock. Okay. Now this has pretty serious implications, right, when we start thinking about kind of intergenerational transmission of inequality, right? And I think that's what I want to think about, right? If you think of poverty traps, right? I mean, this is precisely the kinds of a mechanism that can generate it, right? The next generation, right? The difference between test scores, right? So what is very interesting is, right, most people think that the closer to the fault line, mean learning has fallen. That's true. But what is also true is the standard deviation of learning has increased closer to the fault line. So the differences between the rich and the poor are much greater now, closer to the fault line than they were away from the fault line, which we are thinking is, right, is the baseline for how things would have been in the absence of the earthquake. So it has really worsened things for the very poor. So I think that's really the big issue. The second big policy issue really is children. I myself was very involved in the aid effort, and I'll talk about that. A lot of effort went into this earthquake. I mean, it was not that there was government dysfunction or that society was not aware of it. I mean, it was unprecedented volunteer effort. Over $1 billion in aid came into this area. And you can see, right, consumption has recovered. But I think it's very clear that children and young children and mothers who have kids in utero, I mean, they're a different population. You really have to have designs specifically for them. Unfortunately, I don't know, I don't have data, right, as to what happened right after the earthquake and what kind of mechanisms were parents doing in terms of intra-household allocation of aid, or what were the aid workers doing, and so on, right? That would have been really interesting to have to know. So there's a lot of things that it helps us think about all kinds of allocative decision-making problems, both within the household and, of course, for policy too. Okay, so that's kind of the bottom line. Now let me tell you about the study a little bit. Huge earthquake. The activated fault line is the Himalayan frontal thrust. I'm here, so this is a plug for LUMS also. A bunch of students set up this relief website. We got really into it. So this is more than just a research study for it. A lot of us spent, including my co-author Jishnu, about 6 months of our lives working in this area after the earthquake. So it's nice to be able to see the long-term effects on now. So we did a lot of this stuff and did a survey in June 2009. Random sample of 126 villages in affected areas. We first did a census, all the households in this area, 28,000, and then did a 10% or so roughly detailed survey. So this data is coming from the 10%. So these are some pictures. I don't know if you can see them. This is actually a school right after the earthquake in these tent schools. We have lots of stuff on this. I can talk more about it. But so the key thing that I want to think about is distance to the fault line. And we constructed a full kind of geological hazard model talking to these geologists. But the distance to the fault line is the key one, right? There's slope, there's elevation, all this stuff, but this is the really one. So you can see we have GPS readings on all these households. So you can see that closer to the fault line, as you hit ground zero, well, there's no ground zero, it's the fault line, okay? As you get closer to the fault line, destruction of houses is almost complete, right? It's about 80% to 90% of the homes were destroyed. Deaths are not comparable to the tsunami. I mean, if you look at the tsunami graph, it looks like closer to the fault line or the tsunami hit area, it's closer to our housing thing. So it's not that many deaths, even though it's a large number of deaths. Okay. In terms of our identification, right? I live in California, right? So which is this is the San Andreas fault line, right, on the left. And you would think, right, the distance to San Andreas fault line is not random, right? I mean, I know about it, right? Why do people live closer to the fault line? You know, you would think that there are some characteristics of people who live closer to the fault line that are different from people who live away from the fault line. So this comparison is not valid, right? You can't do this, for example, for floods, because I do think that people who live closer to rivers or who live closer to coastlines are different from people who live away from the coastline on observed and unobserved characteristics. But our area is not just one fault line. There was one fault line that was activated, which is the Himalayan frontal thrust, but look at this. There are like 65 fault lines in that area. And any of them could have been activated. It was just that this particular one activated, right? So in some ways, this population distribution, this distance, is truly, one would think, exogenous to anything else. So when we look at distance to the fault line, what we're really capturing is the effect of the earthquake. So that's basically kind of our identification story. Okay. Migration away, kind of within household migration, we talk about it, right? There's a lot of insecure property rights in that area. A lot of land is divided, but the property title is still in your grandparents' home and all that, in your grandfather's name who has died like 20 years ago. So very few people actually left. There is migration kind of, but within households, right? So there's some people who work in the Middle East, Gulf, outside. People are really tied to their land. I mean, this is anecdotal. But very few even went to tent cities that government set up after the earthquake. So people were staying there. So you don't see that. Okay. Aid spillovers. This is aid. We have a very good measure of aid and what people got. And you can see it really drops very drastically as you move away from the fault line. So a lot of the aid was mostly concentrated closer to the fault line. Okay, recovery. So this is all the stuff, right, after the quake. And you can see, right, there's only kind of one significant variable, and that's infrastructure index, and that's going the wrong sign. It's negative, which means the farther away from your fault line, the less is your kind of physical infrastructure, right? Because a lot of recovery money came in. So on every other dimension, if you look at consumption, if you look at public infrastructure, there's no difference in as far as distance to the fault line is concerned. That's what we're really calling recovery to parity, right? If you look at enrollment, there's like no difference here, right? Distance from the fault line. Okay. Now most people, Aceh and other people have stopped right here, right? If you look at, but ours up, right? What we call coming up short, if you start looking at recovery deficits in children besides infrastructure. So this is height, right? Weight for age, you don't see any effect, right? Which is expected, right? Weight for age is an indicator of your current well-being, right? Not the cumulative, right? Height we think is like the cumulative effect. And here, so this is our kind of main result, right? One of them, which is these are kids who were either in utero at the time of the earthquake or within the first 1 year of their life. I don't know if you can see it that well. But basically, these are z-scores, right? So it's like 0.025 per kilometer, right? This is linear in distance from the fault line, and it is declining as these kids get older. And basically, the omitted is 7 and above. What am I doing all this time? The omitted is 7 and above. So as you hit 4 to 6 at the time of the earthquake, there's virtually no effect on your height. So the younger kids are the ones who are getting most of the effect. This is another way of showing it. Might be a nice graph. It's not now continuous in distance, but what you can see is that the height gap between people who are living closer to the fault line versus away in a discrete way is way greater when they are very young compared to as they get older. This is the cognitive. We tested a lot of kids. What you see is as you move away from the fault line, the test scores really improve. So like 40 kilometers away from the fault line, you are 0.32 standard deviation away. How much is that? Well, you know, these Abhijit Banerjee and et cetera had these studies in India where you get this one extra helper in classroom, right? That's about this kind of an effect. So people living away from the fault line is as if they got an extra teacher in the classroom compared to these people, right? Or before the fault line, they had 2 teachers, and people who are living closer to the fault line, you took 1 teacher away. That's how much learning difference exists 4 years after the fault line. Okay. So the other interesting point is that cognitive shocks occur even in children that did not suffer a biological shock. Okay. This is the mitigation effect, which is we interact maternal education with our test scores, and we find a very big negative, right? And then what we do is we have a nice IV, which we have done in another published paper on maternal education. So we instrument for maternal education. So both of these are kind of causal, both the distance to the fault line and maternal education, and we find very large negative effects on the cognitive deficit, right? I won't go through the numbers. I have like 1 minute. On the height side, you don't see much. Okay, you don't see any kind of maternal. I'm just showing the interaction coefficients. You don't see any effect of maternal education in terms of mitigating the height, right? So it's the with distance. Now, what is it about maternal education, right? That's a hard question. So this is kind of a reduced form result, right? Mother's education matters, but what is it about mother's education that matters? That's a very difficult question to answer, because mother's education can matter in so many different ways. So one of the things we did, at least I can show you something, right? Which is, we looked at villages there was no school choice, there was only one school. So it could be that moms switched schools, right? So more educated moms sent their kids to better schools after the earthquake or something of that sort. What we find is when we restrict our sample only to villages with one school, even there, the maternal education effect is very strong there, right? That's the big interaction. So it's not coming from switching kids around in school. There's something really coming from the household. The channels, right, for maternal education, right, there's a lot of assortative mating, right? It could be that the more educated mom has a more educated husband, is richer, all of that. We can't rule any of that out, even though our IV results are there. But if you regress the IV education on partner stuff, so there's lots of ways the maternal education could have come in. So that's kind of a hard question. Okay, this is interesting. There was disruption after the earthquake in schooling. So it's about 0.14 of a week for every kilometer, right? So basically, if you're like 40 kilometers away versus at the fault line, it's about 6 to 7 weeks of disruption difference. Now, is that enough? I don't know, that's the real channel. So you can see that kids who were scoring better had less of a disruption than kids who were scoring poorer. But I don't think that's enough evidence, but we do have that. Finally, I want to show you just one graph. We did these quantile regressions, and so as you move left on the x-axis, these are kids who did better in school, right? So they are from the top quantiles, and you can see that this is what I'm plotting is the interaction effect. Sorry, the top quantiles are on the right hand side, the 99th percentile. And what you can see is that the top kids, this is the interaction effect of distance. What you can see is that the worse your results are, the stronger is the effect of the earthquake. So the earthquake is really hitting kids at the bottom of the test score distribution. That's where the fault line effect is much more. So in some ways, right, okay, I'll stop right now. Conclusion, all of this stuff I've already told you. So fungible aid, this is what I want you to think, right? Fungible aid was not sufficient to mitigate effects on very young children. It had a regressive effect as far as cognitive deficits are concerned. In utero, it affects everybody. What's going on? This has larger implications, right? For all kinds of violent stuff, right? I think about it. There's so much violence going on in Pakistan. Kids are exposed to it. We have done another study on mental health. We're getting very strong results there too, on adult mental health. And these are 4 years after the fact. So we think that these effects can be very permanent, right? And some effects hit everybody, whether you're rich or poor. Some effects of shocks nobody can do anything about, especially if you're little. Some effects are really worsening possibilities of mobility, of inequality. I think that, what is happening is, right, there's like a lost generation, right, that emerges out of this. And I think that the implications for larger Pakistan, right, are very real. All this stuff, everybody talks about growth and energy, that's great. But what is happening to these kids right now as we see extreme acts of violence taking place around it, I mean, we are doing these trauma studies, right? I think these have large permanent effects. And for some of these effects, the poorer you are, the worse is the situation. And this is the causal story. I think the identification is pretty complete. Okay, thank you.